Billionaire secretly followed his old black maid after work. What he saw made him cry. At a secluded estate overlooking Lake Union, where every corner was swept by state-of-the-art security systems and every movement recorded in digital logs, Richard Coleman, a quiet billionaire in the medical technology industry, discovered that something was unfolding beyond his control. Over the course of 3 weeks, 3 small items had vanished from his storage room without leaving a trace. There were no signs of forced entry, no alerts from the system, no camera captured suspicious activity, just a handful of inconsequential things: a bottle of hand sanitizer, a box of nutritional supplements, a few cold tablets, a roll of adhesive bandage, small enough not to disrupt, yet strange enough to draw the attention of Richard, a man who believed everything could be governed by data and discipline. He was not one to be shaken by randomness. In his world, 3 recurrences meant a trend, not coincidence. He began reviewing access logs, security footage, automated reports. It didn't take long before the name Marjorie Ellison surfaced on each of the nights where discrepancies had occurred. Marjorie had worked for his family for nearly 30 years, since he was a young widower struggling to rebuild a life in the wake of loss. She was black, elderly, quiet, precise, and had never taken more than 3 consecutive days off. Every morning she arrived before 7. Every evening she left precisely at 8:15. She never complained, never asked for more, never imposed. She was a constant, a quiet foundation of the house. And yet, it was precisely that sense of order, when broken by the numbers that didn't align, that unsettled Richard. He didn't grow angry, nor did he confront her. What he did was open his phone, check the city map, and set a reminder on his watch. The next evening, he gave his driver the night off, stepped out of the villa wearing a long grey coat, and drove himself. No security detail, no one by his side, just him, and the gnawing discomfort that had settled in his chest like a soft, persistent knocking at the edge of his thoughts. He parked far from the villa, where the streetlight failed to fully illuminate his license plate, and at exactly 8:15 he saw Marjorie step out through the side gate. In her hand was an old green cloth bag, its straps frayed at the edges. She didn't rush, she didn't look around, she showed no sign of worry. She walked to a bus stop 2 blocks away, stood beneath a flickering lamppost, and boarded the number 33 heading south. Richard waited a few seconds, then started the engine. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for, maybe an explanation, maybe evidence, or perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it aloud, he was hoping to be wrong. All he knew was that he couldn't sit still, and what he was about to witness wouldn't unmask a thief. It would shatter long-held assumptions and forever alter the way he understood people, trust, and the woman who had quietly passed through his life for 3 decades without him ever once asking where she went after she stepped beyond the threshold of his home. Before we go any further into the story, where are you listening from? And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I'll tell you something even more extraordinary. You're listening to this story on Emotional Echoes, a channel where every detail is told with heart and deep empathy. If something within this story has stirred something inside you, take a moment. Hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it too, because sometimes the smallest moment can spark the greatest change. And let us know where you're tuning in from by leaving a comment below, so we can see where in the world this story has found you. Now, let us return to the journey Richard never thought he would take, where a cloth bag and a city bus would lead him toward a truth that no dataset could ever hold. The number 33 bus pulled away from the stop with a soft hiss of brakes and the pale glow of yellow lights spilling through its windows. Richard followed from a distance, far enough not to be noticed, yet close enough not to lose sight. He rarely found himself in this part of town after dark, and it was even rarer that he sat behind the wheel for more than 10 minutes without a work-related purpose. But now, with his headlights casting faint beams along the back of the bus and the silhouette of a woman framed in its shifting light, he knew he was doing something that defied all logic. Marjorie sat upright, her cloth bag resting on her lap, both hands gently clasped over it, as though steadying something delicate inside. No one sat beside her. The other passengers gazed out the windows or nodded off, wearied, as if each was simply trying to make it through one more long day. The bus rolled deeper into the southern edges of the city, away from glass towers and the glow of polished signage. The roads grew rougher, pitted with potholes. The sidewalks uneven. Shops had shuttered early, their lights out, leaving only a few windows glowing from the second stories of old buildings. Richard recognized few of these streets, though they still belonged to the same map where he owned part of a hospital and 3 office towers. The bus stopped near a dim intersection with no traffic light. Marjorie stepped off and walked a short distance before turning down a narrow side street. He parked half a block away, switched off the headlights, and sat quietly in the driver's seat, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. From that vantage, he watched her push open the door of a 2-story building with peeling paint and a faded sign that hung above it. Rainier Youth Outreach Center. The glass door was clouded, too blurry to see through clearly, but the fluorescent lights inside cast reflections of moving figures. Richard opened the car door, pulled his coat tighter, and walked toward the building. He moved quietly to a side window, where the plastic curtain had not been fully drawn. Through that small gap, he saw Marjorie unpacking food onto a long plastic folding table, the kind found in church basements. Transparent containers were neatly arranged, each labeled by hand in simple script: rice, beans, boiled vegetables, chicken soup. These were not leftovers, nor were they charity scraps. Each box was prepared with a care that made it clear the giver wanted the recipient to feel worthy of being nourished. Around her gathered more than a dozen children, the oldest perhaps 12, the youngest no more than 4 or 5. One wore an oversized coat, another mismatched socks. They stood in a quiet line, no pushing, but their eyes never strayed from the table. A little girl with curly hair tied in 2 puffs looked up and asked, "Miss Marge, where did the food come from?" Marjorie leaned down, handed her a box of soup, her voice soft and husky. "From kind people who no longer need it, but it's still warm enough to fill your belly." The child nodded, asked no more, took the container, and walked toward the long bench at the back of the room. Richard stood motionless outside, his breath light in the crisp night air. Not because he was shocked, not because he felt shame, but because for the first time in many years he felt like a bystander in a story he had believed he was entirely in control of. Marjorie had not stolen, she had not hidden. She had simply done what needed to be done, without waiting for anyone's permission. But what held Richard there, eyes fixed on the scene beyond the window, was not the food, nor the number of children, but the quiet she created. She gave no speeches, she asked for no recognition. She simply placed each container on the table with the same silent care. She had folded his shirts for years, made his bed each morning, set the teapot to the exact temperature he preferred, all without name, without noise. He stepped back from the glass, walked slowly toward his car, and sat in the driver's seat in silence. A single question echoed in his mind, one he had not expected to hear within himself. How can you live alongside someone for 3 decades and not know where they go at night, not know what they eat, not know whom they care for, not know what hope they carry in an old, frayed bag? Beneath his hands, the steering wheel grew cold. And for the first time in many years, he did not think about stocks or assets or quarterly goals. He thought about one child who received dinner thanks to a woman he had long regarded as part of the furniture of his house. And he knew then that what he was about to do next would not be about refining a system, but about understanding a person. Returning from the Youth Outreach Center that night, Richard Coleman sat quietly in his car for a long while, before stepping back into the villa. The porch lights flicked on automatically, the iron gate opened without a sound, and the facial recognition system scanned his features just as it always had. Everything functioned with seamless precision, not a moment out of sync, just as he had always lived. But this time, it was that very perfection that made him feel strangely out of place. He walked inside, took off his coat, hung it on the ebony rack near the stairs, and went straight to his office, where 3 large screens still glowed softly despite his absence for nearly 2 hours. A digital report from the executive board had appeared, showing that the company's quarterly profit had exceeded projections. The desk lamp cast a warm yellow light across the polished walnut surface, reflecting the image of a teacup long since gone cold. Richard looked at it all the way. One might gaze at a museum exhibit, well-maintained but drained of life. He was the man the entire city feared in a boardroom. The man the press called the quiet architect of the intelligent healthcare network that stretched across the western United States. He had built his company not with slogans or media appearances, but with risk calculation models, management algorithms, and an executive team that never deviated from schedule by more than 5 minutes. They said he never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He only had to look directly and say a sentence, usually 3 or 4 words long, and everything snapped into motion. Some described him as the ideal leader, others called him a cold machine. Richard never refuted either. He never believed he needed to be understood, only trusted. He lost his wife at the age of 32. A simple accident on a rainy highway, with no one at fault and no one left alive. After that, he stopped playing piano, stored the instrument away, and never touched a key again. Instead, he poured himself into work, expanding the company, building smart homes, connected hospitals, remote healthcare platforms. He no longer went to parties, no longer sat down to dinner with anyone. Every meeting was scheduled by email. Every emotion filtered through layers of data, reports, and probabilities. Marjorie was one of the few people in his life who existed outside of a contract or a calendar. She arrived each morning, cleaned, cooked, checked the room temperature, watered the plants, then left without a sound. Richard knew the teapot would always be at exactly 76 degrees, his ties pressed to the precise fold, and the white shirts hung in perfect color order. He knew she was never late. But he didn't know her age, didn't know where she lived, didn't know if she had children, and certainly didn't know where she went when she walked out the door each evening, what she carried with her or for whom. It wasn't a lack of care. For Richard, it was simply the way systems operated. As long as everything followed protocol, there was no reason to ask questions. But that night, as he sat again in front of the screens and typed a few commands to review the storage logs, he no longer saw the data as he once had. He no longer viewed red alerts as threats to property, but as whispers from a reality he had never allowed himself to enter. Each missing item now took the shape of a small hand receiving a meal. Each timestamp matching Marjorie's access was no longer evidence of wrongdoing, but the quiet heartbeat of a woman who had chosen to do the right thing in silence. Richard turned off the screens. He did not know what he would do next. But the one thing he knew for certain was that he could not return to the life he had lived before, as if he had never seen those children, never heard Marjorie's husky voice speak of kind people, and never realized that sometimes the quietest presence is the most important thing we ever had and never truly saw. After turning off the screens and sitting in the soundless room, Richard Coleman remained in his chair. The wall clock ticked forward, minute by minute, with mechanical indifference, but he no longer cared about time the way he once had. He reopened his computer, not to review project milestones, but to do something he once considered a waste of energy, rechecking the smart home access logs, not through aggregated algorithms, but with his own eyes. He wanted to see each line, slowly, in this house, Every movement was recorded. When a door opened, how long the lights stayed on, who set the kettle to boil, who entered the storage room. Everything was marked with timestamps down to the exact second. Richard scrolled through the records from the 3 nights that had shown inventory discrepancies. Just as he recalled, Marjorie accessed the food storage room at 8:23, 8:17, and 8:21 on 3 separate evenings. Each visit lasted less than 4 minutes. He clicked into the internal camera footage. The screen lit up with the image of Marjorie wearing a beige cardigan, her hair neatly tied back, a small notepaper in her hand. She took nothing in haste. She simply opened the cupboard, selected a few items, checked the labels, and placed them gently into her cloth bag. There was no urgency, no hesitation, as if it were a routine task. As if, should someone witness it, they might understand. Richard enlarged the image and examined the items she chose. A box of cereal nearing expiration, a pack of juice boxes, unopened but dented, an over-the-counter cold medicine with a cracked lid. All were items he had never touched. Things routinely flagged by the storage team for disposal. He pulled up the inventory logs. As expected on those 3 days, the items had been marked by the system as unsuitable for use, but had not been officially scanned for removal. The fault was not in the act of taking, but in the failure to complete the deletion protocol in the system, which meant the software still registered those goods as present in inventory, triggering the shortfall alerts. Marjorie, in her role as housekeeper, had no access to removal permissions, but she knew enough to see what was destined for the trash, and she had quietly carried them to where they were needed most. For the first time, Richard felt the system he had proudly designed reveal itself as rigid and sterile. Every line of code had been crafted to optimize efficiency, prevent loss, increase profit. But not a single line had been written to account for compassion. He searched for Marjorie's personnel file in the company database. A sparse entry, only a few lines. Start date, salary, vacation record, no emergency contact, no performance notes, no commendations, no mention of the more than 20 years she had lived in this home as a silent part of its rhythm. The more he looked, the more he felt breathless, as though he had just glimpsed a horizon far larger than any he'd measured before. He remembered her face in the footage, her eyes steady as she inspected each item, her aging hands careful, as if she were folding his dress shirts for the morning. In his world, where every number held weight, she had long existed as a blank space, an essential part of the structure, but not one that needed naming. But now, as he looked again at the data that had once been the center of his life, he realized it had never told the full story. And in that moment, Richard understood that what needed changing was not merely a process. It was the way he perceived people, the way he understood kindness, the way he recognized the presence of those who had never asked for anything, yet always gave, quietly, consistently, and without needing to be seen. The next morning, when Richard Coleman awoke, everything in the house unfolded exactly as it always had. The temperature control system had warmed the room to the perfect degree. The coffee machine began its cycle precisely at 7. The screens in his study displayed his scheduled meetings with European partners, and the steady stream of executive updates continued in real time. Everything was flawless, just as he had always demanded. But what he had never anticipated was that the sense of suffocation now rising in his chest did not come from any system malfunction, but from the very smoothness of its operation. Because now, he understood there were things that lived outside of formulas. There were people surviving in the cracks he once deemed irrelevant. After cancelling his afternoon meetings, Richard drove himself once again. No driver, no assistant, no pre-arranged itinerary. Just him and the silver-grey car pulling away from the lakeside villa, rolling through the familiar city streets where buildings bearing his name glinted in the morning light. But he did not stop there. He kept driving south, past the business district, into roads where the paint on signs had begun to fade, where the pavement was uneven and ground-floor windows were sealed with sheets of plywood. Discount banners hung loose on crooked nails. Corner stores opened for only a few hours each day. This was Beacon Hill, a neighborhood once known for its immigrant communities, where many lived just within the margins, where the evening news rarely ventured unless there was fire or tragedy. Richard parked a short distance from the Rainier Youth Outreach Center. The building was as worn as it had been when he last saw it, but something about it looked brighter today. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight struck the wall at just the right angle, or maybe it was because this time he had not come to hide. He had come to see. He walked slowly to the door, not going in, only standing still, watching. Through the fogged glass, he saw a circle of children sitting quietly, listening to a woman reading a story aloud. The voice was not Marjorie's, perhaps another volunteer, but she was there, in the corner of the room, arranging meals on a folding table, lifting each box, wiping the lids, labeling them with the date. The movements were careful, familiar, and silent. No one in the room noticed him. No one needed his attention. They had existed here, sustained this space not with resources, but with presence, with the act of sharing what little they had, and with the quiet persistence to tend to what society had long overlooked. That was what weighed on Richard most. Not that he had been unaware these places existed, but that he had lived beside them for years and never once stepped inside. Even his charitable contributions had been handled through legal counsel, routed through intermediaries, measured for impact and brand alignment. But here there was no branding, no recognition, only food warm enough to comfort, hands steady enough to serve, and a small, resilient community trying to build a place where children might believe in something again. He stepped back from the door, returned to his car, and sat for a long time in the driver's seat. Through the windshield, he watched a boy ride a bike with a bent rear wheel, his left leg lifting higher than the right on every pedal. A man passed by, pushing a shopping cart stacked with crushed cans and bags folded into neat bundles. Life here made no room for excess. Everything had a purpose. Every slice of bread, every pill, every worn-out cloth bag. And he, a man who once believed he understood how the world worked, suddenly realized he knew nothing of these streets, these homes, or the people living a parallel life he had never bothered to notice. Richard did not get out of the car this time. He just sat there, quietly, like a student hearing his first lesson on the human heart, not through books, not through charts, but through the gaze of a woman who had silently boarded a city bus each night, carrying what others were about to throw away, to plant something that might still grow in a corner of the city weathered by time, but never entirely drained of hope. The next morning, Richard Coleman returned to the Rainier Youth Outreach Center, this time with a clearer purpose. He brought no entourage, made no call ahead, offered no introduction. He simply carried a plain paper bag filled with a few food items he had selected himself from the kitchen of his own villa, things he had never considered before as tools for something good. In contrast to the reserved, almost austere figure he presented in conference rooms and strategy meetings, Richard's steps this time were lighter, not because he had transformed overnight, but because, for the first time, he was beginning to listen. The door to the center opened with a soft chime. Behind the front desk was a young man in his 20s who nodded without suspicion. Perhaps because Richard was dressed simply, or perhaps because in this place no one bothered with judgment. Richard handed him the paper bag and quietly made his way into the common area. The space was just as modest as before. A long dining table stood at the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched plastic chairs, many wobbling from missing screws. On the table were trays of portioned meals, a teapot, a water jug, and a nearly empty jar of honey. Children sat scattered about, some laughing as they ate, others hunched over their food as though counting each grain of rice. At the head of the table, Marjorie was sitting, gently placing slices of egg onto the plate of a thin boy beside her. She didn't see Richard at first, and he didn't call to her. He leaned quietly against the wall, watching the scene as if it were an old film playing before him, something simple yet deeply moving. Suddenly, a boy of about 8, sitting near the end of the table, leaned over and whispered something to a younger child. The two of them broke into quiet giggles. It wasn't loud, but enough for Marjorie to turn and offer them a look of gentle reproach. The older boy straightened in his seat, though the glint of mischief still danced in his eyes. Richard stepped toward the table, as if searching for an empty chair. The same boy looked up at him, not frightened, but visibly curious. After a brief pause, the boy asked in a small voice, unsure if he was allowed to, "Are you Miss Marge's friend?" Richard stopped. It was a question he had never expected to hear. Not about his wealth, not about his title. Just a simple, direct question. "Are you her friend?" He met the boy's gaze, clear and innocent, yet probing in the way only a child's question can be. After a moment, Richard nodded. "I think I am." The boy smiled and leaned closer, offering his words as if sharing a precious secret. "Miss Marge cries a lot, but never in front of us, only when she's doing the dishes. I saw her eyes get red. I think she misses her granddaughter." Richard didn't ask any more. He simply sat down across from the boy and poured himself a glass of water. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup, not from the cold, but because, for the first time in many years, he felt himself shrinking in the presence of people who had nothing, yet somehow held more than he ever had. Marjorie walked over, her eyes passing over him as if uncertain she was seeing what she was seeing. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't begin with questions or reproach. She simply placed her hand on the boy's shoulder and turned to Richard. "Haven't seen you sit at a table with others in a long time," she said softly. There was no smile, but in her voice was something very close to gratitude. He met her eyes with a softened look, a silent reply that said he was learning how to listen. And perhaps for the first time in many years, that dining table ceased to be a place for distributing dinner. It became something else entirely. A place where strangers began to see that they could still belong to the same space. As long as someone was willing to sit down, stay quiet, and listen to the whisper of a child. That evening, after Marjorie had finished cleaning up the stacks of plastic containers and sent the children off, some into the care of temporary guardians, others to thin mattresses laid out in corners of the common room, she quietly stepped out of the center. Richard no longer followed behind her as he had in those early nights. This time, he walked alongside her, just a few steps apart, and neither of them said a word. Together they moved down the still streets of Beacon Hill, where the pale yellow streetlights cast uneven shadows across a patchwork road. Eventually, she stopped in front of an old 3-story building, its iron railings rusted, the paint peeling around the worn concrete steps. Without turning, she spoke just loud enough for him to hear, her voice soft as wind. "If you want to know everything, come up. 3rd floor. No elevator, so take it slow." Richard nodded and followed her up the creaking stairs. Each step gave a low groan beneath their weight. A faint mustiness hung in the air, mingled with the smells of old cooking and a trace of peppermint from somewhere behind closed doors. At the top, Marjorie pushed open an unlocked door. The apartment was small, just a living room, a bedroom, and a narrow kitchen, but astonishingly neat. Clothes drying indoors hung in tidy rows. School books were stacked precisely on a low desk. A small bed stood by the window, its blanket folded into a perfect square. Beside it sat a pair of worn children's shoes, their heels frayed. In the middle of the room sat a boy, reading. He looked up at the sound of the door. His eyes were bright, his hair gently curled, and his hands held a paperback worn at the corners. He blinked at the unfamiliar man, then glanced at Marjorie without asking a thing. He simply smiled. "This is Elijah," she said. "My grandson. His mother died when he was 5. His father, no one knows where he went. I brought him home from the city shelter. They didn't think an old woman like me could raise a child, but they didn't see what I saw." Elijah stood up, offered a polite nod, then sat down again, as though used to visitors coming and going. Richard looked at him, and something stirred within him, something he couldn't quite name. This boy wasn't loud. He didn't demand attention. He wasn't overly curious. Yet there was a quiet light in him that Richard had never once seen in all the meetings, mergers, or power plays of his past life. He sat down on a wooden chair across from Elijah, his hands resting on his knees with careful composure. "What are you reading?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. Elijah held up the book, his tone soft but clear. "I'm reading Times, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer times again. I like the part where Tom runs away to the island and everyone thinks he's dead. But really, he just wanted to know who would miss him." Richard blinked. The boy hadn't said it with a grin or a wink. It wasn't a joke. The line landed in Richard like a quiet bell tolling somewhere deep. Who would miss me if I disappeared? And he realized that, in one way or another, it was a question he'd been carrying too alone in a villa by the lake, respected but untouched, where people admired him, feared him, but never truly knew what he thought, what he felt, or if he ever felt lonely at all. Marjorie poured 2 cups of tea, placed one in front of Richard, and quietly sat beside Elijah. No one spoke for a while. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt like a language of its own, shared between 3 people who had never truly sat together before. A man who had lived half a life built on data and control. A woman who had quietly nurtured hope in a forgotten corner of the city. And a child, holding a question about existence in his clear, steady gaze, asking not for answers, but for someone to simply stay long enough to see him. When Richard stood to leave, Elijah spoke, stopping him just at the threshold. "Will you come back?" Richard looked at the boy and nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I will. Next time, I'll bring you a book I loved when I was your age." Elijah smiled, a real smile this time, wide and warm. And in the boy's eyes, Richard saw something he hadn't felt in years. A promise unspoken, a place to begin again, and a key to a door he had kept locked in his heart for far too long. On the drive back from Marjorie's 3rd-floor apartment, Richard Coleman did not turn on the radio as he usually did. Inside the wide, silent cabin of his car, he let his thoughts drift with the streetlights sliding past the windshield. The image of Elijah, with his worn book, his intelligent gaze, and that hesitant smile, remained vivid in his mind. But what stayed with him more deeply wasn't the boy. It was Marjorie, the woman, who had quietly carried more weight on her shoulders than anyone who had ever worked for him. The next morning, Richard asked his internal staff to retrieve Marjorie's original personnel file. A thin folder, stored away for 3 decades, arrived at his desk in a worn paper cover. On the first page was her full name, Marjorie Ellison. Date of birth, address, contact information. Nothing remarkable until he reached the line listing her previous occupation. Clinical nurse at the city's central hospital. He frowned, turned the page. There, clipped between the documents, was a letter of recommendation from a department head. It stated clearly that Marjorie had worked in emergency care, was highly skilled and deeply compassionate. No reason was given for her departure. Richard sat in silence, staring at the fading, rounded handwriting. He felt for the first time like a man who had passed blindly by a painting for years, seeing only the frame, never pausing long enough to truly look at the image within. Marjorie had once been a nurse. She had saved lives, worked overnight shifts, faced life and death on a daily basis, And yet, for 30 years in his house, he's been known only as the woman who brewed tea at the perfect temperature, who folded his shirts with precision, who wiped the dust beneath the stairs. He sighed. He remembered a time, years ago, when he had come down with a bad cold. Marjorie had made him a cup of ginger tea with honey and silently placed a warm towel across his forehead. At the time, he'd chalked it up to the routine care of a housekeeper. But now, he understood that was instinct. The trained touch of a nurse. The calm of someone who had held the hands of the fevered. Someone who had learned to listen to the human body when words failed. No one in that villa had known her past. There were no pictures on the walls of her standing in a hospital ward. No stories shared, no questions asked, and she had never offered to tell. Richard looked out the window, where autumn trees trembled in the wind, yellow leaves falling one by one. He remembered her eyes from the night before, when she introduced Elijah. She didn't speak of sacrifice. She made no claims. She simply stated the truth, the way someone might pass along a worn blanket to someone in need, quietly, completely, with no expectation of thanks. That afternoon, Richard returned to the youth center without announcement. In his hands was a picture frame. Inside, a black and white photograph, enlarged from a scanned copy in her file. Marjorie, wearing a white nurse's blouse, stood beside a hospital bed, a chart in her hand. She was looking straight into the camera. That gaze wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same gaze he had seen every morning in his villa, but had never truly understood. He found her in the kitchen, dishing out porridge for the children. When she saw him, she opened her mouth to speak, but he held up the frame first. "This is you, isn't it?" Marjorie looked for a moment, then nodded. Her voice was steady, unchanged. "Yes, I used to work in the ER, but that was long ago. Nobody remembers that now." Richard shook his head. "But I will, and I think the people here should too." He offered her the frame. "If you're willing, I'd like to hang it here." She hesitated, then gently took it, her hands trembling slightly but firm in their grip. "I don't need to be remembered, Mr. Coleman. I just want Elijah to know how hard I tried. That's enough." Richard looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Then let Elijah be the one to tell that story, when he's ready." And in that moment, in the quiet kitchen of a worn-down center, tucked into a corner of a city many chose to forget, a story once buried was picked up again, not to be celebrated, but to be held. Because no act of love, no sacrifice offered in silence, is ever truly small when it is remembered with care. After hanging the photo of Marjorie in the modest kitchen of the Rainier Youth Center, Richard Coleman returned home, carrying a silence he couldn't easily name. In the days that followed, he no longer reviewed reports, the way he used to. Every number now reminded him of specific faces, of slices of bread, of cartons of milk, of children's quiet whispers. One morning, he reopened the internal monitoring system and pulled the access logs for the food storage room over the past 6 months. He read them line by line, slowly, as if turning the pages of a diary written in numbers. There weren't just 3 instances, as he'd once believed. Marjorie had entered the storage room nearly 20 times, and she didn't always take food. Sometimes it was a few bottles of water near expiration. Once it was medical gauze. Another time an unused box of noodles. Never anything expensive. Never anything reserved for him. Only the items deemed unfit for standard circulation. Items the system had already dismissed. But Marjorie, with her intuition and compassion, had seen the worth that others overlooked. There were no recorded requests, no official forms, no emails, no notes left behind. She had simply acted, quietly, steadily, as though she already knew that if she asked, the answer would be no. And if she waited, another child might go to sleep hungry. By now, Richard understood. She hadn't asked, but she had never stolen. What she took was no longer his to offer. These were things cast aside by the system, stripped of value. And she, through nothing more than human care, had returned them to the places where they still meant something. He remembered her eyes that first night when he confronted her. Eyes without defiance, without fear, only a calm, unshakable clarity. He realized now it was not the gaze of someone accused, but the gaze of someone who knew, with quiet certainty, that she had done the right thing. Richard called in his assistant and requested a complete overhaul of the inventory system. He wanted to create a new classification, community reusable goods, an official category, with barcodes, with oversight, with a proper handoff process, and he wanted the first person to oversee it to be Marjorie Ellison. The assistant stared, startled, and asked if he was sure. Richard replied simply, no one was better suited. That afternoon, he returned to the center with an envelope in hand. Inside was an appointment letter, printed on the letterhead of the company he had founded. Marjorie was wiping her hands on her apron in the kitchen when he arrived. When he held out the envelope, she looked at him for a long moment before taking it. I don't need a title, Mr. Coleman. I don't need people to know what I used to be. Richard smiled. But someone will need you. And this time, there'll be a system behind you, not standing in your way. He paused, then added, not everyone has the courage to do the right thing without permission. I used to think that was a flaw. Now I see its strength. Marjorie said nothing more. She opened the envelope, glanced over the contents, then folded the paper neatly. Her eyes softened, not from sentiment, but as if a small missing stone had been gently placed back into the right place inside her. The room went still. Only the quiet hiss of water boiling in the kettle remained. Outside the window, a child sat down at a table, opening a worn notebook with a cracked spine. Richard watched for a moment, then turned to Marjorie. Maybe you didn't need permission, but I need to say thank you for showing me something I spent a lifetime never learning to see. She placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, a touch so subtle it barely registered, and yet, in that small gesture, was a kind of wordless acceptance. And on that quiet afternoon, in an old kitchen tucked inside a forgotten neighborhood, a man began to relearn his very first lesson in trust. Not from a classroom, but from a woman who had never asked for permission, yet always did what was right. 1 week after Marjorie received her appointment letter, Richard Coleman sat alone in the executive boardroom on the top floor of his company's headquarters. Morning light poured through the thick glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished stone floor. The screen in front of him displayed rows of charts, columns of data, projections and metrics, just like every meeting he had led for more than 2 decades. But today, he did not look at them the same way. The pride he once felt at every upward trend, every benchmark surpassed, had faded into something quieter, something deeper. His mind no longer lingered on what the numbers showed, but on what they missed. A dinner box shared in the evening, a quiet hand on the shoulder, a child's whisper at the edge of a worn table. The system he built had tracked every movement within his villa, every open door, every lit bulb, every inventory item logged and stored. But it had never told him why Marjorie chose the nearly expired goods instead of the new ones. It had not told him how Elijah felt eating a warm meal after school. It could not measure the patience of a woman who had, without anyone noticing, quietly changed the lives of children the world had overlooked. He remembered a night not long ago when he and Marjorie sat together after hours at the center. She had told him about her days as a nurse. There was a time, she said, when she worked night shifts in the ICU, caring for an elderly patient who had no family left. Every night, she wiped his face, held his hand through fevered dreams. When he died a month later, no one mentioned her in the official records. No line in the report noted that she had been the only person at his bedside when he took his final breath. The hospital document listed only the cause of death and the time. Nothing spoke of presence, of dignity, of human touch. And as she finished the story, she looked at Richard and said in her usual calm voice, "Data never tells the whole story, Mr. Coleman. It records what's easy to measure. But the most important things never show up on a chart." Since that conversation, Richard could no longer look at data the way he once did. He began to question what had been left out. Not to challenge the system's efficiency, but to remind himself that behind every number was a life, a context, a story. Even the smartest system could never replace a heart willing to listen. He had the internal software redesigned, not to collect more data, but to include a simple, free-form note field where staff could share context, feelings, the things you couldn't code. A note like, "This milk carton is dented but still usable," might be the difference between waste and nourishment. A comment such as, "This little girl often skips meals because she's ashamed," could spark a chain of thoughtful human action. He also began inviting logistics workers, once seen as auxiliary links to strategic meetings. He asked what they saw, what they felt, what they thought when deciding whether to discard or keep a product. For the first time, voices that had long been silent were now being heard. And they told stories no annual report had ever captured. One worker recalled a single mother holding back tears as she accepted a food package. She didn't want her child to see her asking for help. Another said a boy always chose the driest bread because there was no refrigerator at home to store fresh food. These stories were not in any profit summary, but they were the reason the system needed rebuilding, not to be more powerful, but to be more human. Richard knew he couldn't change the whole world, but he could begin where he had once turned a blind eye. He could revisit every line of data and ask, behind this number, is there someone trying to survive that we've failed to see? Is there someone needing to be acknowledged not as a data point, but as a person? And above all, he had learned that there are truths which cannot be measured in units. They can only be touched by kindness. And that was something he had never noticed until a woman who never asked permission but always did what was right stepped into his life, without noise, without request, and left an indelible mark on the way he would see the world from that day forward. On the day Richard Coleman made the decision to reallocate part of the company's product development budget into an internal community support fund, the executive boardroom filled with polite resistance. A few finance directors, careful with their words, raised concerns. Phrases like poor timing for redistribution or the need for further evaluation of long-term impact floated around the room. But Richard did not retreat. He knew now what truly made an impact. Not the dollar amounts announced in press releases, not the photo ops with oversized checks, but real action, presence, listening, and change right where it was most needed. After that meeting, he returned to the Rainier Youth Center, carrying a gift of a different kind, not cash, not groceries. He brought with him a plan, a blueprint to rebuild the kitchen, expand the storage space, and transform the common area into a space for learning and reading. When he presented the design to the center's leadership team, there was no applause, no cheering. But their eyes lit up not with excitement, but with something rarer. A trust rekindled, a flicker of belief returning after too many broken promises. Marjorie wasn't there. She was down the street with Elijah at the free dental clinic. But when she came back and heard what had happened, she said only one sentence. "I hope this time you're doing it for the children, not because it makes you feel better." It wasn't criticism. There was no sharpness in her tone, but the words hit Richard with the quiet weight of truth. He knew what she meant. There is a thin line between helping and condescending, and many powerful people cross that line without even knowing it. He used to believe giving was enough, that writing a check fulfilled his part. But now he understood what people needed was not distant compassion. It was genuine companionship. Helping is not lowering your hand from above. Helping is stepping down, standing alongside, and asking, What do you need? Then, listening to the answer. The following Saturday morning, Richard returned to the center. He didn't bring documents. No donations. He simply sat at a plastic table in the courtyard where the kids were coloring with wax crayons. Elijah was next to him, focused, coloring a picture of a house with 3 windows and a small vegetable garden. Richard asked, "Whose house is that?" Elijah didn't look up. Just answered, "It's a house I drew for the kids who don't have one." Richard said nothing. After a moment, he picked up a colored pencil. Not to color, but to start drawing a tree beside the house Elijah was still working on. The boy looked over, smiled gently. "You know how to draw trees." Richard smiled back. "I'm learning from the beginning." It sounded like a joke, but it wasn't. He really was learning again from the beginning, learning how to sit beside someone without thinking he stood above them, learning how to hear a story without interrupting it with advice, learning how to give without waiting for thanks. That afternoon, when Marjorie returned and saw Richard sitting among the children, wax stains on his hands, shirt sleeves rolled up, laughter in his voice, she didn't say a word. She simply handed him a damp cloth to wipe his hands, then sat down beside him. He looked at her. No explanation needed. She nodded, as if confirming that something had quietly, finally found its rightful place. And in that moment, Richard knew he was no longer an outsider looking in. He had stepped into the story of people once forgotten, not as a benefactor, but as someone who had come to understand that true help is doing what is right, not for recognition, not for return, but because to turn away would be a failure of the heart. It was a lesson no data set could teach, but a woman named Marjorie and a boy named Elijah had taught him with the quiet weight of their lives. On an early autumn morning, just as the air began to carry its first crisp bite, Elijah stood by the window of the third-floor apartment, both hands wrapped around the straps of his old backpack, one corner carefully stitched where the fabric had torn. Today was presentation day at school, the assignment. Speak about someone you admire most. The teacher had let the students choose their own topic, and Elijah hadn't needed much time to decide. He chose to speak about Miss Marge. But tucked into a quiet corner of his paper was mention of someone else, someone he called my surprise uncle. As Marjorie wrapped a scarf around his neck and tightened the knot, she asked softly, "You're sure? Talking about me is fine, but the other person?" Elijah nodded, his eyes lit up. "He comes every week, sits on the floor with us, colors, does math, listens. He never promises anything, but he always shows up. I think he'll get there earlier than you expect." Marjorie smiled gently. She didn't reply. She just adjusted his collar and walked him to the door. But when it closed behind him, she remained standing for a moment longer. There was something in what Elijah had said that made her heart still for a beat. Perhaps it was the absolute faith of a child in someone who had once lived unaware of their existence. Or maybe it was the way Elijah spoke, as if he knew with quiet certainty that something good would arrive, even if no one guaranteed it. At that same moment, Richard Coleman stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie. He had a meeting with a group of new investors that morning, but he had asked to delay it by 30 minutes. The reason was simple. Elijah was presenting at 9 o'clock at a small public elementary school near the Rainier Center. Richard didn't want to miss it. When his car pulled up to the school gates, the security guard eyed him with thinly veiled suspicion. Few men in tailored suits on their way to investor meetings showed up at a school tucked inside a working-class neighborhood. But Richard didn't care. He asked for directions to Elijah's classroom, thanked the guard with a small nod, and made his way down the hallway at an unhurried pace. When he arrived, the classroom was already full. Children chattered. Chairs creaked. The whiteboard bore the words, "Topic, Someone I Admire." The teacher looked up, surprised to see him, but recognized him from the times he had come to pick up Elijah at the center. She gave a slight nod and motioned for him to take a seat at the back. Elijah stood at the front of the room. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes held steady. He spoke of Marjorie, of how she always served dinner to the other kids before taking any for herself. He spoke of how she folded clothes as though she were folding something far more precious than fabric. Then, in the final moments of his speech, Elijah paused. He looked down at the paper in his hand, then slowly looked up again. "There's someone else I want to talk about," he said. "At first, I didn't think he'd come back. But he did. Every time. Always on time. Sat next to me. Didn't need anyone to introduce him. I don't know if he thinks I'm special, but I think he is. Because he's real." Elijah then lifted his chin and looked straight to the back of the room. "Uncle Richard, I know you're busy, but I said you'd come earlier than anyone thought. And you did." The entire class turned around. Their eyes landed on the older man in the pressed shirt and dark jacket, sitting quietly, his gaze softened by something that looked a lot like wonder. No one spoke, but they didn't need to. Richard gave a slow nod, the kind that carries weight without needing words. A silent agreement, a sacred acknowledgement of something just entrusted to him. When the class ended, he waited for Elijah in the schoolyard. The boy ran to him, smiling wide, unable to hide his joy. "See, I told you. I was right." Richard bent down, adjusting one of the backpack straps that had slipped off Elijah's shoulder. His voice was low, but warm. "Yes, you were right. Next time, I'll be even earlier." And as they left the schoolyard together, Richard felt something unfamiliar but deeply rooted rise, within him a feeling of being needed. Not because he was a CEO, not because he had the power to give, but because he had chosen to stay. To stay inside a story he once believed had nothing to do with his own life, a story he had once passed by. But now, it was where he had found the very best part of himself. On a crisp Saturday morning, as the first cool hints of fall brushed the city, the Rainier Center felt warmer than usual, not because of the weather, but because it was the day the children looked forward to the most all week, storytelling day. And the storyteller was none other than Richard Coleman, whom the kids fondly called Uncle Rich. No one remembered exactly when that name began. Maybe it was the first time he sat beside Elijah in the reading corner, or perhaps a child had blurted it out once, and the rest simply liked the sound of it. But now, when someone said Uncle Rich, everyone knew exactly who they meant. The man who once arrived in tailored suits now came in soft sweaters, canvas shoes, carrying a few well-worn books and a paper bag filled with sweet pastries. Every Saturday morning, right on time, he joined the children in the circle they had carefully arranged on a large rug. They waited eagerly, not just for the stories, but for the way he told them, with no trace of teaching, no air of authority. He didn't speak at them. He brought them in, as if he, too, was living each story, again for the first time. Once, he told a story about a boy who dreamed of being a musician, but had to give up that dream because his family was too poor. Richard never said the boy's name, only spoke in a calm, steady voice. At the end, a little girl whispered, "Did he ever become a musician?" Richard paused, then replied, "He became someone else. But every time he hears music, he closes his eyes and imagines he's playing on a stage. Maybe the dream didn't come true the way he wanted, but it's still alive." After each story, the children would gather around asking questions. "Have you ever cried?" one would ask. "Did anyone tell you stories when you were little?" another might say. These were the kinds of questions Richard once might have deflected, but now he answered them with sincerity. He told them that he used to believe crying was weakness, but now he knew it was courage. And he shared how, as a child, the only person who ever told him stories was an old driver who made up tales on their morning ride to school, trying to coax a smile out of a boy who rarely smiled. Elijah didn't ask much. He usually sat quietly, watching Richard's every movement, as if afraid to blink and miss something precious. After each session, the two of them would clean up, stacking books, picking up wrappers, wiping the floor. One afternoon, while sliding the books back onto the shelves, Elijah said softly, "Uncle Rich, when I grow up, I want to do your job." Richard smiled. "You want to be the CEO of a company?" Elijah shook his head. "No, I want to tell stories. Grown-ups who know how to tell stories to kids. They're the best kind of people." Richard didn't respond at first. But inside him, something stirred, something gentle and strange, like a memory being healed. Like all the years spent chasing results, goals, metrics, were being replaced by the quiet, present weight of being trusted. Maybe the miracle wasn't in the story he told. Maybe it was in the simple truth that a man who once didn't believe in change had become the very reason children believed in the world. These storytelling mornings had no script, no stage lights. Just a middle-aged man, a circle of children on a rug, and a room filled with quiet anticipation. And for Richard, it was the truest stage he had ever stood on. And each time Elijah asked, "Uncle Rich, what's the story this week?" Richard knew he was doing the right thing, not to rewrite the past, but to plant something lasting in the soil of stories that had never been told. Stories that would live on, as long as someone was willing to sit down, listen, and tell them with their whole heart. That morning, sunlight spilled across the top floor of the Coleman Group's headquarters, flooding the boardroom in soft gold. A space once known for the sharp rustle of papers, the steady tapping of keys, and the fierce rhythm of debate had been rearranged. There were no projections on the wall, no profit charts, no budget outlines. Instead, at the center of the room, stood a single chair positioned directly across from the long row of executive seats. The first chair, the one no junior employee had ever been invited to sit in. Richard Coleman stood quietly, looking at it. The chair was unremarkable on the surface: dark brown leather, sturdy wooden legs, a few light scratches across the seat. But today, it held a different kind of meaning. He had just sent out a formal invitation to someone this room had never welcomed before, Marjorie Ellison, and not a single person seated at the long table believed it to be a routine decision. When Marjorie entered, she wore a simple white blouse, her hair neatly tied, and in her hand was a modest cloth bag. Her steps were slow, but her posture was steady. Her gaze held no shyness, no pride, only calm. Richard gestured for her to sit in the first chair. The room went silent. Not from disrespect, but from not knowing quite how to begin. There was no title to introduce, no resume to read, but when Marjorie opened her bag and pulled out a thin folder, every eye turned toward her. "I brought some ideas," she said, her voice even. "Not to demand anything, just things I've observed across more than 30 years inside Mr. Richards' house and outside of it." Then she spoke. About redirecting surplus food from the company's restaurant chains to support centers like Rainier. About starting a mentorship program where senior executives would sit with young people regularly, not to speak, but to listen. About leaving one chair empty at every strategy meeting as a symbolic seat for those not present, but most affected by the decisions made around that table. Richard said nothing. He let her speak. And in every word he heard lived experience, insight, and a kind of wisdom no business school ever taught. When she finished, the room was quiet for several long seconds. Then Richard spoke. "Thank you," he said, softly but clearly. "And I believe, from this day forward, we should always keep this first chair for someone like you. Not out of gratitude, but because the vision you bring is something we've forgotten for too long." A young financial officer sitting to Richard's left leaned slightly forward and asked, gently, "If I may, why didn't you share these ideas earlier?" Marjorie turned to him, a quiet smile on her lips, tinged with something heavier. "Because I didn't think I was allowed to. In Mr. Richard's house, I was the housekeeper. In places like that, older black women aren't invited to the table. They're expected to clean it. But I'm not here today to complain. I'm here to say sometimes the clearest voices come from the places no one thinks to listen to." The silence that followed wasn't one of shock, it was the hush of a truth laid bare. Richard looked around the room and said slowly, "We can't go back and rewrite the years we overlooked, but we can choose how we move forward with the people we should have walked alongside all along." After that meeting, the first chair never again stood for power. It became a symbol of listening. Whenever there was a conversation about community, equity, or responsibility, Richard left that chair empty. A quiet reminder to everyone in the room that even those not present deserved to be counted. And from that day on, the story of a woman who once wiped down tables now echoed in the very room that never made space for her, not because she fought her way in, but because someone finally had the courage to invite her to sit down. And that was how one chair changed the way an entire company saw the world, not through power, but through justice, and through the kind of respect that does not need to be earned, only recognized. That afternoon, after the long meeting, in which the first chair had finally found someone truly worthy to sit in it, Richard Coleman stood alone on the balcony outside his office. A soft breeze slipped beneath the collar of his shirt, and the last light of day poured through the tall buildings, casting a golden warmth across every pane of glass. In his hand was a small card Marjorie had left behind after the meeting. It was not long, just a single line written in her hand. "I have no degrees, no titles. I only have a heart that knows how to listen." He read that line over and over again, as if it were the key to a door he had unknowingly kept shut for decades. Richard had always believed the world operated on reason, on strategy, on precise calculations and carefully laid plans. He had trusted in structure, in authority, in the voices of those with credentials and stature. But Marjorie had never taken a single leadership course. She had no letters of recommendation from prestigious universities. She had never stood on a stage to speak about management or inspiration. She simply stood at the edges, watched, listened, and chose to act in moments when no one else was paying attention. Richard remembered the times she said nothing when he was irritable, the quiet days she brought leftover food for someone who needed it more. He had once thought of her as merely a devoted caretaker. But now he understood that to do what she had done, she had to see what others overlooked, to feel what no system could ever measure. And what she had, the very thing he once dismissed as small, had turned out to be the foundation for all meaningful change. A heart that knows how to listen, not to reply, but to truly understand. The next day, Richard apologized to the executive board for missing the quarterly financial review. Instead, he went to the Rainier Center, carrying with him a box of tea and a soft leather notebook. He wasn't there on business. He just wanted to sit beside Marjorie for a while. When she saw him, she was surprised. He smiled and held out the notebook. "I'm here to learn today. I think it's time I talk less and learn to listen the right way." She didn't refuse. She simply poured the tea, placed a small cake on a plate, and pulled up another plastic chair beside her. He sat down, opened the notebook, and wrote the first line. "I don't know everything, but I can learn if I learn to listen." That entire afternoon, they didn't speak much. They listened to the children playing in the yard, to the quiet rhythm of pots simmering in the kitchen, and now and then to fragments of conversation drifting in from the volunteers. But in that silence, Richard felt himself changing, little by little. He was no longer the man who had come to lead or to help. He was learning how to be present as a human being, without defenses, without status, without agenda, simply present and ready to hear what the world was truly saying. About children who did not want pity, about women who carried strength in their silence, about communities that did not need saving, only recognition. That evening, as he left the center, Marjorie walked him to the gate, as she always did. Before parting, she placed her hand gently on his arm and said softly, "You know, sometimes you don't have to be the best. You just have to be the one willing to sit long enough to understand what others are trying to hide." Richard nodded. In the golden light of the sunset, he saw more clearly than ever before why his life had once felt so hollow, despite having everything, because he had never truly listened. And now, with a heart slowly opening, he understood that the greatest changes do not come from bold declarations, but from the quiet moments when we are humble enough to see others without judgment, and to listen, not to respond, but to truly see them. The way Marjorie had done all her life. 1 year after that quiet afternoon, when Marjorie said all it takes is a heart that knows how to listen, the 20C, the vacant lot behind the Rainier Center, had transformed. Where there was once a patch of cracked concrete and a few rusted iron chairs, there now stood a small garden with rows of fresh green vegetables, a humble wooden awning, and a handmade wooden sign gently carved with its name, the Humanity Seed Fund. Elijah was the first one entrusted with tending to the garden. He had grown taller, his voice a little steadier, though his eyes still held the same brightness. Every Saturday morning, he came to water the plants, check the soil moisture, and take notes in a small leather-bound notebook gifted by Uncle Rich. The cover bore a silver inscription that read, "Even the smallest task, done with a big heart, is worth remembering." The Humanity Seed Fund was not a massive organization with grand offices. It began with a simple promise from Richard Coleman that his company would set aside a portion of its annual profits not for numbers, but for people. This fund was not used to purchase more equipment or to build glittering glass towers. It was dedicated to offering scholarships for children in under-resourced neighborhoods, opening vocational training classes for the elderly, and nurturing grassroots initiatives that moved slowly, quietly, but with deep and lasting impact. And all of it was coordinated not by high-ranking executives, but by those who had once stood silently on the margins of the system. Marjorie was invited to be honorary advisor. She declined any formal title, but agreed to participate on one condition. Before any grant could be approved, she would ask 3 questions. The first, does this truly come from a community need, or is it just an idea born in an office? The second, will the people receiving it feel supported or patronized? And the last, after 1 year, if we're no longer around, can this project stand on its own? Elijah still remembered the first time he attended a fund meeting. He didn't fully understand all the adult language being used, but he listened closely, sitting in that brightly lit room, serious in his posture, a well-worn pencil in hand. When asked what he thought about supporting a group of kids who wanted to start an outdoor art class, Elijah replied, "I think we just need a place to color where grown-ups don't tell us we're doing it wrong." The room burst into laughter and then grew thoughtful, because in that single sentence lay a truth many adults had long forgotten. That creativity needs room to breathe, not rigid lines to stay within. From that day, Elijah was given a new role, not as a manager, not as an ambassador, but as the one who reminded everyone of the real reason the fund existed, to let small things grow, just like Elijah himself. From a boy once curled up at a dinner table tucked away in the shadows of a dim city block, he now stood in the light, not as a recipient, but as a contributor. One day, while pulling weeds in the garden, he looked up and asked Marjorie, "Will this fund last forever?" She paused, then answered, "As long as someone remembers why it was created, it doesn't need to live under this name. It will live in the way each of us chooses to live with one another." Elijah didn't say anything else. He bent down, gently picked up a blade of grass, knocked over by the wind, and tucked its root back into the soil. And in that quiet moment, perhaps he understood too, that the greatest thing one human being can do for another is not to build something grand, but to patiently tend to what is most fragile. The way Marjorie once did, the way Richard is still doing, and the way he himself would grow, carrying within him a seed of humanity, planted not by big gestures, but by the small, enduring kindnesses that live forever in the hearts of others. One late afternoon in mid-May, as lavender began to bloom purple along the walkway leading to the Rainier Center, Richard Coleman sat quietly on an old wooden bench beneath the familiar shade of the maple tree. He had brought no laptop, no folders in hand, just a thin book and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Elijah ran past, cradling a small potted plant, calling out as he went, "I'm about to plant a few more tomato vines. Do you think we'll get enough sun?" Richard looked up at the sky and replied, "If the soil is good, the plant will find its own way to turn toward the sun." The answer was not just for the tomatoes. It was something he had come to understand from his own life. A human life, if placed in the right environment, given trust and patience, will naturally grow toward the good, without pressure, without applause. That was how the Humanity Seed Fund continued to work. Quietly, without signs, without press conferences. What they did was arrive where they were needed, place a single brick, plant a seed, and step back so those at the center could keep building with their own strength. There was a time, during a corporate board meeting, when a young executive suggested that Richard's name be placed on every project the fund supported as a way to honor the initiative, but Richard had shaken his head. We don't need a world where everyone waits to be thanked. What matters is that change happens, not who gets credit. Because gratitude, when it becomes an obligation, can turn kindness into a debt. But if we do what is right, simply because it is right, the outcome will speak for itself. Since becoming more involved with the community, Richard had come to realize one truth. The kindest people are those who never ask for anything in return. They give, then step back. They offer, then quietly leave. Like Marjorie. Like the single mothers who came to the center early each morning to portion out food for other families before taking their own children to school. Like Elijah, who patiently retaught fourth-grade math to a younger child without once complaining or seeking praise. Richard had once believed that gratitude was the greatest reward a person could receive. But now he knew there was something greater still. It was when no one needed to say thank you, because everyone was already living within a shared ecosystem of giving, receiving, and mutual respect as something natural and unspoken. One day, Elijah brought him a drawing he had made himself. It showed a large, ancient tree with deep roots anchoring into the earth and wide branches shading a group of children sitting and learning beneath. On the tree's trunk, in slightly slanted handwriting, he had written, "Thank you, but I know you don't need that." Richard held the drawing in silence. He simply nodded and placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. In that moment, he knew he had come far enough to see the very heart of change. Not numbers, not awards, but the quiet realization that what you planted has taken root, and those who received it are now planting for others. That was enough. That afternoon, as he prepared to leave, Marjorie stood at the door of the center, holding a small bouquet of fresh herbs she had just picked. She said, "Take some home. Not to eat, but to remember that what grows from the earth never forgets its roots." Richard took it without hesitation, and in his heart, a thought rose with clarity. A world where no one needs to be thanked is a world where everyone feels valued, where everyone believes they can create something good, and where no one needs to bow down or look up just to be seen. That was the world he wanted to live in, and with each small but steady step, he was helping build it, one quiet act at a time. One Sunday morning, Inside the small library at the Rainier Center, sunlight filtered softly through the windows, casting a gentle glow across the aging bookshelves and the worn rugs stretched across the floor. But on this morning, it was not children gathered for story time as usual. It was a group of adults. They sat in a quiet circle, each holding a small notebook in hand. Among them were familiar faces of parents, a few social workers, and even a recently retired former executive. At the center of the circle sat Richard Coleman, holding a small hourglass. He wasn't there to teach or to lead, only to open the first session of a new kind of learning. It was the first in a special series called When Grown-Ups Learn to Listen. The idea had taken root during a conversation between him and Marjorie. She had said that children don't shut down because they don't know how to speak. They shut down because grown-ups stopped listening a long time ago. Not everyone sees it, but children often speak in many ways, not only through words. Averted eyes, a throwaway comment, a stubborn behavior, repeated again and again. These are signals. The problem is that adults tend to react rather than listen. They rush to correct, to judge, to teach, without ever asking why. So the program was not built around lectures or advice. It was designed as a shared practice of something deceptively simple and deeply rare. Listening, without interrupting, without offering solutions unless asked, without evaluating even when you don't understand. On the first day, each participant was asked to write about a time when they were a child whose voice was ignored. Some spoke of being disbelieved when they said they were bullied at school. Others remembered wanting to learn art, but being forced into economics. A middle-aged woman, voice trembling, shared that through all of her childhood, no one had ever asked her how she felt at the end of the day. When it was Richard's turn, he told a story no one had heard before. At 12 years old, he had stopped eating for 3 straight days, just to see if anyone would notice. But everyone simply assumed he was acting out. No one asked why. And from that silence, he learned not from care, but from its absence, that if he didn't take care of himself, no one else would. The story didn't darken the room with drama. It quieted it with recognition, because beneath the armor of adulthood, each person had once been a child who hadn't been fully heard. After 3 sessions, something began to shift. A father shared that for the first time he had sat still while his daughter told him about a fight at school without interrupting or trying to fix it. To his surprise, she had hugged him and said, "I just needed you to listen." A single mother said that for the first time she asked her son, "Do you want me to stay quiet and just sit next to you?" And the boy had nodded, pulling her gently to sit beside him on the floor. Of all the lessons the program offered, perhaps the most profound was this: to accept that we do not know everything, that we don't need to be perfect, only present, patient enough, humble enough to ask, "How are you feeling, and what do you need from me right now?" Richard looked around at the faces in the room. This wasn't a class. It was a journey of adults learning, slowly and tenderly, how to be companions instead of controllers. And when the session ended, there were no applause, just hugs, just quiet glances that said something had been gently repaired. As he left the center, Richard turned to Marjorie, who stood at the doorway. He said, "Maybe listening is the first skill we're born with, but the last one we learn to do right." She smiled and said nothing, because she knew there are things that do not need replies. They only need to be heard, and held quietly in the heart. On a grey afternoon, as the spring rains poured down over the Beacon Hill neighborhood, washing the air clean and softening the edges of the day, Richard Coleman stood beneath the awning of an old corner store. He was waiting for Marjorie, who had stepped inside to pick up some dry goods for the Rainier Center. Across the street, Elijah was helping an elderly man push a cart through a puddle, steady and sure in his movements, not waiting to be asked. Richard watched the small, deliberate act and felt a quiet ache stir inside him. Once, he had believed that every social problem could be solved with data, strategy, and the most efficient models. But now, he understood something that all the years spent in top-floor boardrooms had never taught him. That if you don't see with your own eyes, if you never step beyond your safe and comfortable place, you will never truly understand. He remembered the early days of running his company, when reports from the analytics team often recommended cutting costs from community programs. They said the impact was unmeasurable, the benefits unclear. Back then, Richard had nodded in agreement because he had never walked into the places where those budget lines could make a difference. He had never seen the way a child smiles when handed a free lunch. He had never heard the soft sigh of relief from a mother whose child finally had someone to help with homework. He had never felt the quiet, grateful squeeze of a handshake from a man relearning how to fill out a job application after 10 years of unemployment. None of that shows up in a spreadsheet. It doesn't sit neatly on a growth chart, and it certainly cannot be translated by the cold language of metrics. But once you've seen it, you cannot remain unchanged. Marjorie stepped out of the shop, arms full with a heavy bag of groceries. Richard took it from her, and together they walked back toward the center. Beneath the umbrella, he asked, "Did you ever think I would change?" Marjorie smiled faintly. "I didn't think, I just hoped. And I knew eventually you'd see what you needed to see." She didn't name it. She didn't need to. Richard understood. It was the stories that never make the headlines. The people who get flattened into a single line labeled disadvantaged in a business plan. The dreams so small they're often not even called dreams, yet still burn quietly in the chests of hundreds, maybe thousands. Like Elijah. That night, Richard opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "If you never step out of your seat, everything you know is only imagined." The following week, he arranged a visit for his company's senior managers to spend a day at the Rainier Center. Not for photo ops or donation drives, but to share lunch with the kids, to listen to a poetry class, to sit in the playground and hear what real laughter sounds like. Afterward, a marketing executive quietly said, "I didn't expect to be moved by a child splitting a sandwich in half." Another manager, without fanfare, requested 3 days off to help Elijah paint murals in an old housing block. No one told them to do it. They did it because they had seen. And once you've seen, you cannot unsee. And you cannot stay still. Richard knew that real change does not come from speeches or slogans. It begins when the human heart is stirred awake by something honest and simple, when you no longer read about someone's struggle from behind a screen, but sit beside them, listen to their voice, see their life, and realize just how little you truly knew. Later that night, long after the center had gone quiet and the lights were turned off, Richard stood alone beneath the front awning. The rain had stopped. The scent of damp earth hung in the air, mingling with the distant sound of crickets. He thought of all the years he had believed he understood life. But only now, stepping down from those high floors, had he truly begun to live it. And he knew the road ahead was still long, still asked much of him, but he was no longer afraid. Because now he had seen. And once you have seen, you cannot go back. You must keep walking. And you must do something with your whole heart. Richard Coleman was no longer just a name associated with financial power or multi-million-dollar decisions. To those who had once passed through the doors of the Rainier Center, he was the man who had quietly stepped down from his lofty heights and chosen to sit beside the small, often overlooked lives the world had long hurried past. Elijah, now in 8th grade, stood taller than Marjorie and still devoted 2 afternoons each week to helping younger children learn to draw and tell stories. Marjorie had long since left her job at the Coleman estate, but she had not disappeared. Every morning she could still be found on the bench by the small garden behind the center, where the lavender bloomed in soft purple each May. When someone asked if she still worked as a housekeeper, she only smiled and said gently, I'm still working. Just the work of someone planting seeds of kindness. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Richard and Elijah walked the neighborhood together. The boy asked, "Do you think people will remember what we've done?" Richard looked at him and answered slowly, "What matters isn't whether people remember us. What matters is whether what we've left behind continues to live in how they treat each other every day." And then he added, "We're still here, not to be recognized, but to remind one another that no matter how much the world changes, compassion, listening, and the ability to stand in someone else's shoes will always be what makes us human." This story began with 3 missing objects in a grand house, but it ends with hundreds of chances given, all from one heart that knew how to listen. Maybe you're hearing this story from a place far from the Rainier Center. Maybe your life looks nothing like Richard's, or Marjorie's, or Elijah's. But I believe, somewhere in this journey, something made you pause, reflect, and ask yourself how you're living with those around you. How did today's story feel to you? Did it touch something in your own life? Have you ever passed someone by without realizing they were living a story yet to be told? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you feel from the most honest part of your heart. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like and subscribe to Emotional Echoes so we can continue discovering stories that move the heart and remind us all that life still holds reasons for hope and for love. Share this video with someone you care about, because who knows, you might be the one planting the next seed of kindness. Thank you for spending these last moments listening. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and many moments of quiet joy. Until next time, on Emotional Echoes.